We hear from medieval and ancient sources about plague, war, being constantly present, and famine, plague, war, and famine, being constantly present in the human existence. However, until about the 1970s, there were no systematic studies of epidemics in history. Until Canadian world historian William McNeill published two books which are appendages, as he called them, just extensive footnotes to his main famous volume called The Rise of the West, the story of human community. So his main book was about history from the beginning of time to his present. He was writing in the early 1960s. And then he wrote two footnotes, one on macroparasites. Macroparasites are the people who prey on other people. These are warriors, these are soldiers. Through history, organized violence played a very large role, still continues to play it, and humans had to support ever bigger armies and sustain invasions. So his first book is called The Pursuit of Power, the story of weapons and military organizations since the 10th century until the 20th century. The second book was about microparasites on humans. So macroparasites, armies. Microparasites are the bacteria and viruses. So plagues in general, as he called it. So here I'm going to the beginning of time, but not really to the beginning of time, only 10,000 years ago, with the help of another very famous scholar, James Scott, who is alive and well. He lives on a farm outside of Yale University. So kind of, he is living his life credo. He always studied peasants, and he lives like a peasant. He has cows. He is famous, you probably know some of his books, for the titles like Weapons of the Weak, The Arts of Resistance. His latest book, published in 2017, is called Against the Grain. The earliest humans that we know, like, I'll say, also not just humans, dinosaurs, had disease. There are bones of ancient dinosaurs with evidence of cancer. But we have no evidence of epidemic disease, contagion. We now have some, because the viruses, say for instance, COVID-19 virus, is probably something ancient. The viruses have been present for a long time in animal populations. It just, COVID-19 is something which jumped into human population recently, but this is not a very new story. However, viruses and epidemics in general were not a threat to early humans simply because there were so few of them and they were so scattered. Because they were hunters and gatherers. The early humans, as you know, today is convincingly established and emerged in Eastern Africa. If somebody in one of those scattered populations contracted a virus, he would probably contaminate, infect, the people around him, and those would be, probably 20 people in his band or her band. Even if they die, they would never spread the infection any further because they would have only occasional contact with other humans. Probably once a year, they gathered for some kind of tribal festivities. We think, we try to reconstruct it, that very much like modern hunter and gatherers, who still live somewhere in Australia or in Kalahari Desert in Africa, or the Eskimos in the far north. They meet together mostly to exchange gifts, to exchange women, young women for marriage, to exchange stories, solve maybe some conflicts, and basically to have fun, commemorate, their ancestors for some ritual activities, and then they spread around. Why? Because humans are top predators in all the environments. And if top predators start eating too much and too intensively, they will eat everything available in the environment and they will just die. The humans, or our ancestors, who are basically carnivorous apes, I know that almost certainly some of you are vegetarian today, and this is possible. Luckily, we today agriculture and means of transportation, bringing to you produce from all over the world. But ancient humans who had to depend on what they were finding daily in the environment were very peculiar kind of ape. They were carnivorous ape. They ate meat. In order to gather, well, why meat? Because we have very large brains. Brain, do you realize that brain takes about 30% of all energy consumed by our body? Brain is very calorie intensive. So they had to consume meat. Meat, they probably found by hunting, high calorie meat. Eventually, they became so inventive and so good at doing the hunt that they spread all over the world. They spread even to Australia. They spread to the far north. How about the descendants of monkeys from Africa who live in tundra in the far north and hunt woolly mammoth? It's pretty damn incredible. And because they were so good at hunting, they produced ecological disaster. They probably finished off too much of, we have evidence almost from every continent, every big island that humans discovered. First of all, they killed all the big animals. Why? Because the big animals were slow moving, and that's a lot of meat. Except somehow in Africa. In Africa, big animals, so the early human populations did not manage to kill all the African animals, but they did it with woolly mammoth. They did it on Australian continent, in New Zealand, big birds went extinct, same probably in North America, because probably know that camel comes from North America, but they don't live in North America because they were hunted down. They are 10,000 to 11,000 years ago. So what happens? Then the climate change comes. Climate is always changing, So now we know this from a lot of paleo evidence. However, about 10 or 11,000 years ago, the climate had stabilized. The problem, however, is that humans made the transition to agriculture because animals were dying out on one hand, but because also agriculture became possible. Previously, humans were not stupid. Our ancestors knew the behavior of plants and animals very intimately because they had thousands of years to accumulate knowledge and observations. So they knew what wild grains needed to grow better. For instance, humans long ago started what is the plague for Armenia to this day. They began burning grass in summer. Why? Because they noticed, that burning grass produces better crops next time. It was not necessary for them to do agriculture. They just burnt grass, and then they came back and harvested eventually, better grains. What was more nourishing to them? However, they did not engage in continuous agriculture for the reason that they were intelligent. Because they understood, that after several years of good harvests, the climate might change again, and the climate was changing, up and down all the time, and there will be a drought. If you invest too much in agriculture, you die out. But 10,000 years ago, the climate, or roughly 10, 11,000 years ago, the climate stabilized. So we have lived in a relatively stable climate, not entirely stabilized, but relatively stable for the last 10,000 years, which is why we have civilization in the first place. Agriculture and transition to life in villages was a great step forward, because from that, next we go to pyramids in ancient Egypt, to the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, and then ancient Rome, and eventually, very soon, we arrive at Yuri Gagarin and space travel. Not so fast. First of all, humans, between Neolithic Revolution, so 10,000 years ago, and it took actually a lot. It's not just domesticating of plants. You have to domesticate animals. They could no longer have enough hides to make their clothing, because there were too many of them. So they had to invent textiles. They had to figure out how to cook grains. And for cooking grains, you need fireproof and waterproof container, something you can put on fire with water inside, a pot made of clay probably, but it took a lot of experimentation to invent pottery. So why we call it Neolithic Revolution? Because everything comes together. Boom, and there are villages, and notice, village is always much bigger than a band of hunter and gatherers. Village has several hundred people who are not necessarily related to each other. They have to live together somehow. There must be a village community. Number two, they have to have domestic animals there. Number three, textiles, pottery, and all the new implements which are necessary, like the scythes, so the new tools for cutting the grains. And something also very important, storage. Storage, you have to store somewhere your grain until another harvest. Once you begin storing your grain, two kinds of enemies are going to attack you. One enemy is obviously a rat or mice are going, because you created El Dorado for rodents. They're going to come. What are you going to do about rodents? You domesticate cat. So dog must have been domesticated long ago because dogs are hunting animals. They eat bones, so hunter-gatherers probably domesticated early wolf. You understand that all our dogs are related to wolf. And cat comes domesticated with Neolithic Revolution. But then there is the second kind of predator, humans. So you domesticate a donkey, but somebody comes with a sword and domesticates you and says that you're going to be my donkey. Now, that your grain is going to belong to me, otherwise I kill you. And then you make a very wise decision. Okay, don't kill me. I'm going to give you half of my grain. This is going to be my annual tax or tribute to you. We're going to pay taxes. And for this, you don't have to come and conquer me next time. You just come and we pay again another half of our harvest. So this is called sharecropping. Has been going on for thousands of years and created all the civilizations. If you ever wondered, who paid for all these pyramids of ancient Egypt, for all the sophistication of ancient civilizations. And James Scott, who is not just an agrarian historian and political scientist, who is an anarchist, politically, of course. He hates state power. He showed first, that many humans chose to run away. So when I teach this as my class in Chicago, in Abu Dhabi, I play a reality show game with my students. Who wants to be a pharaoh? In this classroom, who wants to be the pharaoh? No, sorry, you all lost because I started the game. I've been planning, one step ahead of you. I'm going to be the pharaoh. And tomorrow, early in the morning, the boys in this group, you must report to building my pyramid. Girls, you come to my palace. You cook, clean for me, you entertain me. If you have a good voice, it might help. I need somebody to sing to me as I eat. What should be your reaction to this? Kill the bastard. It's obvious. But I'm smart. Not only I appointed myself pharaoh or emperor, I also select, in America, it would be easier. I always had some football players, and you understand this is American football, these big guys. So I will take several big guys and tell them that, no, you're going to be my guard. You're going to receive special rations. You will eat well. You will get the beautiful girls, but you will also be provided with very expensive weapons, with swords. Sword is always difficult to make. And when you see a sword in historical record, archaeologically, any blade weapon, you understand this is a society of domination. Because with a sword, with bow and arrow, you can hunt and go to war. With spear, you can both hunt and go to war. With sword, you can chop nothing but human heads. Blade weapons are only for hurting fellow humans. There is no other use for sword or for dagger. So I will arm with these, and swords are always very expensive to manufacture because it takes a lot of skill, it takes a lot of fuel, high-grade metals, mastery of it, and then it takes a lifetime of training to be a good swordsman. So I give this time to train to my soldiers, and they will oppress you. So your next reaction should be, okay, it looks like rebellion is no longer possible. Yeah, let's move away. So where would you move away? Probably to a place like Europe, because it had big forests in ancient times. It had swamps, something like Asterix and Obelix. Right? So you live in a village far away, you live somewhere in the mountains, you hide from civilization. So I needed this long introduction, because I'm afraid that you all come with a certain baggage in your heads, thinking that progress is always a good thing. Going with new technology is great. There is a price. There is a price to be paid for progress, and I needed, to sort of soften up some of preconceptions in your brains. One of the prices, however, is something which we discussed today and which for a long time remained somewhere in the background of history: epidemics. Where did we get the epidemics? From domestic animals. Early humans literally lived with their goats, cows, and pigs. The problem is that those animals bring their own, endemic to these animals, microparasites. Because microparasites, they are forms of life. And they're form of life which is parasitical, meaning that they eat from other, they multiply using bodies of other animals. So for them, many cows is food. Many humans is even more food. So we are just the food supply, for these microparasites. More humans, the microparasites who figure out how to eat humans, how to dwell on humans, are going to win. Because how many bats are there in China, but how many Chinese are in China, right? So this is probably how did we get COVID-19. So from cows and pigs, and also, very full of parasites are birds, chicken, full of parasites, typically. So what do we get from them? Smallpox, for instance. Smallpox, flu, influenza, grippe, comes from chicken. There are several debates on how did we get, from which specific animal what, but more or less it's clear that once the humans live in larger communities, like in villages, once the population is denser, once the populations are mingling with domestic animals, we start getting parasites from those animals. We don't know how do we get them, until Louis Pasteur, really until the late 19th century, we wouldn't know. So the germ theory of disease is something new. It's only 150 years old. Previously humans thought that it was, of course, wrath of gods or evil spirits. So you call somebody, to say something, go away, evil spirit. So the first question I wanted to get very clear with you is that humans began contracting infection disease with the Neolithic Revolution 10,000 years ago. We went to live in dense communities in agriculture. We have to have animals, domestic animals there. And from domestic animals, we start getting our disease. And because we live now in larger communities, we began spreading the disease among humans. Now, what happens with big invasions or with trade? We heard about Silk Road, and you heard probably about Alexander the Great. So what happens, when Greeks from Macedonia invade Persia and Armenia here, and they go all the way to India and to present-day Uzbekistan, Afghanistan. Probably from Afghanistan, it was no longer very far away to China. And China is famous for silk. Silk is luxury good, which people, it is said that Cleopatra was the first queen to dress exclusively in silk. So one of the reasons we still remember her. You understand, that silk is produced by a caterpillar called silkworm. With more trade and with more invasions, with more humans globalizing their community. So again, is globalization a bad thing? But globalization brought disease. Many of the disease that we know actually come from China because it just naturally happens. So that in northern China, which is desert, which is next to Mongolia, very dry, in the desert live big fat animals called in English, what do you know what is woodchuck? They are rodents, you know, big rodents. They live in holes in the ground, in the steppe, and there are fleas who live on them, and those fleas spread. You know, it turns out that they actually spread bubonic plague. What happens if too many Mongols with their cows and horses come into contact with other populations? So they bring not only cows and horses, they bring the fleas inside the fur of their cows. There are fleas, and the fleas are bringing the infection. In southern China, which is tropical, you know, there are palm trees in southern China, so on the border with Vietnam, there is another very big pool of disease, which is mostly the viruses. So one of them is, unfortunately, the present one, but it's also all kinds of influenza, flu. So Hong Kong grippe, you know, so it comes mostly from southern China and from the birds. Originally was part of the bird. Because why it comes from China? Because China is big, because there are many Chinese, because Chinese have been doing trade with the rest of the world, globalization, and that's how, you know, with silk or with Mongols of Genghis Khan, you know, you get your disease. So the earliest known incidents is probably plague. We're not quite sure what was that during the siege of Athens by Spartans during the Peloponnesian Wars. That's pretty ancient. But the really big disease hits Roman Empire. And you remember, Romans are always in fight with Parthian Arshakids, you know, Parthian Persian dynasty. And because Persia is between Rome and China, you know, so there is a transmission going on. So something like plague hits Rome at around 200 AD. What time is this? This is just after good Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius dies, we think, from plague. After him comes his adopted son, Commodus, who was a bad guy. And then we don't know what happened because Romans stopped writing. For another 75 years, something very bad was obviously happening. You know, there are fewer Roman sites, and, you know, they don't build much at this time. So we have a lot of evidence of internecine civil wars. There are so-called soldier emperors coming sometimes, you know, just for several months. You know, they seize power and then they collapse. So we are not quite sure, until recently, we're not quite sure what was going on until we realized, oh my God, it was plague. So Romans bounce back, convert to Christianity eventually, quite soon. Empire is resurgent, and then something kills it. So what is that? We think, you know, another, you know, under the time of, and we have better record for that, Emperor Justinian, the so-called Justinian plague. It came into history under his name, Justinian plague. Justinian is the emperor who built the walls of Constantinople, who built Hagia Sophia, that very same Hagia Sophia, right? And who built, you know, the juridical system, you know, which we know now as mostly as Roman law. But very soon after his death, and already in his time, something bad is happening through Byzantine Empire. However, plague strikes. Both Persia and Byzantium are exhausted from war. Their people are dying now massively. There is a huge plague. And in the middle of it, people from Arabia, calling themselves Arabs, come to visit the Persian king and say that we are from Muhammad. He is a prophet. He's speaking to God. And if you accept our God, we will protect you from the Greeks. What should be the reaction of Persian emperor to this? he ordered to execute, to hang the Arab messengers from the gates of his capital city, Ctesiphon. Several years later, big army of Arabs on camels and horses comes out of desert and defeats the Persians. Since then, Iran becomes a Muslim country. As you probably know, they also conquer Armenia. People at that time would take an epidemic as God's punishment. So don't be surprised that Islam is spreading so rapidly, and it's spreading today. We understand one of the reasons is the epidemic which had just devastated both Persia and Byzantium. So the Arabs are coming into geopolitical vacuum. What actually makes medieval period? Nomadic invasions. There are all kinds of Arabs or Mongols or Turks coming from desert all the time on horseback. Second, religious heresies, all kinds of religious heresies. People start taking religion very seriously. Unlike Romans, for Romans, religion was whatever, as long as you also recognize that Roman emperor is God. The rest is up to you. And now, people are going to war for religion. And the third big is plague, is epidemic. I mentioned already Mongols several times. So Mongols arrive with Genghis Khan, conquer not just half of the world, 3/4 of the world. They began taxing it, and then Italian Genoese traders in the Crimea had some kind of minor tax dispute. The Genoese were sitting tight behind the walls. The Mongols had Chinese catapults, like this. They began throwing first stones, but then they had a brilliant idea because they had people dying in the Mongol camp from disease. They began putting dead bodies on catapults and throwing them inside the fortress. The result was that first the Mongols themselves had to give up the siege because they began dying massively. But then the Genoese, they looked at this at first, oh my God, so we're free. They got on their ships and began rowing back to Italy and dying in the meantime. By the time they reached Italy, more than half of seamen on their ships were dead. And the rest spread the disease. We think, that this is the origin of the great Black Death. Next, the story of the Spanish conquistadors. So they arrive in the Americas. Well, you know the story. Christopher Columbus, who was also Genoese, remember? Italian from Genoa, Genoese. They were the original kind of explorers of Europe. Discovers America, and very soon, small bands, like 200-300 men, with Hernan Cortez conquer Mexico, conquer the Aztecs. And then Francisco Pizarro, 20 years later, conquers Peru with lots of gold, the Incas, the Inca gold. How could this be possible? We realized that it was possible because the Spaniards were conducting germ warfare without knowing it. The Spaniards came with lots of disease that they brought from Europe. Indians, who are the descendants of humans who moved to the Americas probably 10, maybe 15,000 years ago, in the times of woolly mammoth. So they had no contact with the rest of the humanity for several thousand years. For the critical thousands of years, when humans in Eurasia were suffering from disease massively, but also building some immunity, at least some immunity. So measles, which became a childhood disease for us, for Native Americans was totally deadly. So only recently we came to appreciate how many have died. That was the biggest genocide ever in human history, probably 95% of population. And the population was big. There were millions and millions of Indians, and they died within 25, 30, 50 years after the arrival of Europeans. Which also explains why the Europeans start bringing black slaves from Africa Why? Because they needed somebody to work in the plantations in the New World. The locals had died. There were not enough Europeans, so they began bringing Africans, especially Africans who are more robust. They also live in a very difficult environment, and Europeans could not move into Africa because in Africa, the locals were relatively immune, still, again, just like Europeans. Europeans die from smallpox, but not all Europeans. And Africans die from malaria, but not all Africans. So Europeans who were not accustomed at all to malaria were navigating around Africa since the times of Vasco da Gama, right? But they could not go inside Africa. That's the problem. So instead of going themselves inside Africa, they were bringing humans from Africa and turning them into slaves. So here is a paradox. In the New World, Europeans conducted infection warfare, germ warfare against the locals. In Africa, the other way around, the locals were conducting germ warfare against Europeans, which is why America becomes a European colony 400 years before Africa. There is only one disease which Europeans contracted from Native Americans, and you know which one: syphilis. Syphilis, especially, again, as any new disease, was very deadly. In the 16th century, it killed many thousands, hundreds of thousands of Europeans, especially soldiers, because soldiers and prostitutes are the people who would contract the disease most easily. And there were so many wars going on in 16th century Europe between Catholics and Protestants. So syphilis becomes a very big problem for Europeans. Syphilis continued until the mid-20th century, until antibiotics. And by the way, do you know, for instance, Al Capone died from syphilis in prison, from terrible death, because you go first insane, awful. What else does there remain? So how disease was overcome. And there is no, it's a mystery. There is no convincing theory to this day, because disease, especially plague, it still happens in the 17th century, in the 18th century, but it starts going down and down. The numbers are less. Why is that? We think, for instance, Europeans invented quarantine. So the origin of the word quarantine, come from the Italian word quarenta, 40 days, not 14, 40. Quarenta. So every ship, especially if there is somebody sick on board, every ship coming into the harbor of Venice or Genoa had to stay in a special area. The crew were allowed to disembark. Sometimes they were not even allowed, go back to the sea. But they were allowed, into the harbor, but they would have to stay behind the wall in a special containment area for 40 days, called quarantine. Quarenta. Every time, and then people realized that, at least the smarter people in Europe who became then advisors to their governments, that this is the way to go. Probably, we don't know yet, what spreads the disease, but we know that somehow it is coming from sick people. So keep the sick people isolated from the rest of community in quarantine. That's number one. Number two, do you know the story of Edward Jenning, the great surgeon from England? He noticed, that milkmaids, the women who milk cows, milkmaids, and often their own children, never contracted smallpox. Why is that? Because cows have also smallpox. Cows don't die from smallpox. And cows, sometimes they have this small fistula, with pus, understand, so from pox. So when you have pox, like ospa, vetryanka, on the face, Stalin, for instance, why all pictures of Stalin are doctor, they are retouched. Today you would call it photoshopped, because Stalin had actually very ugly skin. He survived smallpox when he was a child. So inside, there are bubbles, and inside there is pools, which is full of viruses. So the women who were milking cows were, and they typically they would have also some kind of cuts or bruises on their hands, so they would be exposed, to this. But cowpox was actually giving them protection against the human smallpox. So Edward Jenning in 1770s, he was a genius, So this is long before understanding what is a virus, but he convinced several women to allow him to make a cut on the arm of their children and put some of the pus from cows, not from humans, there. And these children survived, and they became immune, and very soon, it spread all over Europe. Yeah, great disease control measure. So let's do something about smallpox. There is another great story. It's about cholera. Believe it or not, but cholera was prevalent in European capitals because people basically, what was happening with sewage. So you think, that Paris is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. It is. But until 1968, half of apartments in Paris had no indoor plumbing. So even today, if you go, I recommend somewhere in rural France or I taught for a while in Bordeaux, actually one of the biggest French cities. However, you go into a big, dvor, into a patio, into a courtyard. There are several houses around it, and in the end, and I'm looking at this and thinking, oh my God, I know what is in the end. In the end is the water main, kolonka, the water main with a pump. And then, judging by the smell, it's unmistakable. There is the toilet for everybody. You understand that from the toilet, the bacteria is seeping through groundwater and it gets into the well. So in 1850s, there was another cholera epidemic in London. And there were many debates. What causes epidemic? Could it be because people are smelling bad smells? And there were lots of bad smells. You can imagine, So raw sewage is floating around it. Until one English doctor said, no, you don't smell disease. You drink it. And he ordered through the municipality, and municipality, it's quite interesting. Municipality went with him, the London municipality. He ordered to remove the handles from the water pumps so that people would not be able, can you imagine how annoyed were the women? No more water from the water pumps, only clean water which is brought by horses and by barges. And that stopped the epidemic. So this is one of the most famous, most famous examples in history. How even before knowing what causes the disease was overcome, was contained. 20th century. I'm not going to spend much time over 20th century. You have to understand, of course, that more people, you will all know, died from Spanish flu, which was not Spanish at all, in 1918, 1919. By the way, that includes Max Weber. I learned myself recently. Max Weber died in the very end of the epidemic of Spanish flu. There was typhoid, there were so many other things, and it killed more people than World War I, than any genocide. The big mystery is that Second World War was not accompanied by epidemics. It was terrible. There was Holocaust. Hitler's invasion of Soviet Union, big battle on the Eastern Front, and yet, for some reason, no epidemic. Probably the World War I anti-epidemic measures had worked. And the quarantine measures, the famous, Nikolai Semashko building of so many hospitals for infectious disease. And then another very important co-discovery in the 1940s, right during World War II, antibiotics were invented. Both discovered, both in the West and in the Soviet Union.